Hi, Pam.
Hi, Joanne.
Thanks for joining me on Creative Conversations. Thanks for playing along with this um, passion project of mine.
Okay.
So it's all about just the pulse check for working creatives, is what I call it. Especially if
hmm
you're a writer or artist working in studio, it can feel very isolating. Um, and it's just nice to have an opportunity to check in with other working creatives and to learn from each other as well, keep each other company. Um, you've had a remarkable life, which we will learn about in your memoirs, but you can maybe give us some context. And I'm particularly interested about that in the context of writing memoir, because you've just published your third, not one, not two, but three memoirs.
Right. Yes.
And, it's just a fascinating form that we sort of come to, many writers, many non-writers, of wanting to reflect and tell a story from the past. Um, Give us a little context for that in your life, because you grew up in Australia, you live now in England, and along the way you've seen much of the world, and much of the world in ways that most of us never will. So give us some context for your memoir writing.
Well, when I was growing up in Australia, I was had a very calm, safe suburban life. Obviously, like all young people, I experienced that very small life very vividly. But I wouldn't have thought that there was a great deal to write about. And but um, once I took off on my travels, and I had always felt a desperate desire to see the rest of the world, life became a lot more adventurous and interesting. And but it wasn't until I met my husband, and 7 years later we married, and went to various developing countries because he became a diplomat, that I began to realize that some of the stories and events that were going on around us, and the very colorful life that we were leading, and the colorful characters that we were meeting, were actually, something that really ought to be written down and shared. And in Angola during the Civil War, I got to a point where life was really fairly challenging, with bullets flying around at night, and rats during the daytime, and some fairly colourful and difficult characters to deal with in everyday life. I decided that I'd better start writing some of these things down, or otherwise I'd be likely to fall into a depression and spend my time bewailing my fate. So I started writing the funniest bulletins I possibly could to friends, which was incredibly therapeutic, and gave my friends a lot to laugh about. And when I did eventually settle down to actually start writing the first memoir, I had these bulletins to look back on, and they were a fertile source of material, because just one sentence or one word can sometimes bring back a whole series of events in vivid technicolor. So that was, I didn't keep a diary, but those bulletins and some letters were incredibly useful when the time came to put my life experience down in a narrative form.
So there was some documenting along the way. With regards to your most recent memoir, let's talk a little bit about loss and letting go, what we put in, what we leave out. And this
Yeah,
memoir was much more personal, wasn't it?
it
With
was.
all my soul.
Absolutely. Well, I think the fact that it was a much more personal story was one reason why it's taken until now to write it, because for many years before his death in 2023, my husband had been urging me to write our story, um, because it was a very unusual story, um, in that we met um, when I was 26 and in studying Italian in Italy. My husband was a few years older, but at the time he was a Catholic priest vowed to celibacy, and although we fell, you know, madly in love, he could not marry, and he had, you know, was a person of great integrity who felt that he'd made promises and he couldn't break them. So he went back to Africa for 7 years, and only then came around to the conclusion that, yes, it would be right to change his life path. It came back to my complete astonishment. And we married 10 years after we met. So it was quite a romantic story, at times a very painful one. And he really wanted me to write it. So after he passed away, a few months later, I sat down and thought, right, let's give it a go. So my technique wasn't very scientific or thought out. I sat down and started writing, basically to see where it would go. And much of the early pages didn't make it into publication. And I've found with all three memoirs that, usually you write the first chapter, and when you come to the end of the book, you go back to the first chapter and say, oh my God, no. And those first few pages are severely cut and revised because you realize that those first chapters weren't going where the rest of the book went, or they were too detailed, or you just hadn't got into your style of writing. So my advice to anybody starting a memoir is just write, get it down, because there's plenty of time to revision later. And, the revision is always going to be more extensive, and there'll be many more repeated revisions than you ever envisaged. But as long as you've got stuff down on paper, you've got something to work on. And when you come to the end of the book, you will see the whole pattern. And it sometimes it's useful to write down chapter headings or a plan, but it doesn't always go to plan. And I think any true creative endeavor has its own life, and there's something like almost a creative fervor that takes over, and you get swept along. And I think this is this makes a book that's worth reading when it's written from the heart and with passion, and that's what I tried to do.
So it's almost like the work itself takes on a life of its own. It becomes infused with life because of the attention we're putting on it.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, fiction writers often say that this happens. Personally, I've found that writing memoirs, the same thing happens, because although, one is the character oneself, nevertheless, it's the events and the picture and the shape of the book seems to take on a really passionate life, and I love that. For me, I just can't stay away from the computer. I'm waking up in the middle of the night with a phrase or an idea in my head that just has to be put down before I forget it. And
what part did your your documentary along the way in your life, your artifacts, what part did that play? Or you also described before of having a technicolor memory, sort of seeing things like
yes,
what was that process of? Because memory
well,
implies some degree of accuracy and getting things
well,
yeah,
I
correct.
I
Yeah.
it may sound sort of boastful, but I know I have a very accurate memory, and sometimes it's not always an advantage in conversation, because at times old friends will say sort of, oh, I said X, Y, or Z, and I think, no, actually you didn't say that at all, because I can see what they said almost as if it's written out on ticker tape. So I do trust my memory, but also what I did find I had to check on was chronology, because sometimes we can remember events in vivid detail, but then you think, now, did that happen first or did that happen second? And so I did do a lot of checking for dates and, sort of the chronology of events, the sequence, to make sense of things. And also in my first two memoirs, because I was dealing with historical events in different countries, then I did do a lot of cross-checking of historical facts. For With All My Soul, it was a very personal story, but I still wanted to make sure that I had things exactly right: places, times, dates, and sort of the exact details sometimes of a location where something happened. And that was actually great fun researching that, and reacquainting myself with the baths of Diocletian, or the Church of San Silvestro in Rome, and Gosh, yes, it really did look like that.
And how did you handle the sort of ethics around memory? You know, that people have different points of view. You were certainly traveling in the world, dealing with colonial histories and changing colonial politics. And then, what about when there was a gap in the archives or a gap in memory? How did you sort of handle that part of memoir writing? How did that
Well,
impact you?
well, to be honest, I didn't find too many gaps in archives because it was fairly recent history. Um, there was one interesting thing that did happen that when I published my first book, a reviewer from The Independent took great exception to the fact that I described someone as a Swazi warrior, and she felt that this was a colonial term, and she obviously wasn't aware that in Swaziland, as it was then, now Eswatini, the king, to be one of the king's warriors, was a highly esteemed and honorable position. Um, and so sometimes, as you say, points of view can make a big difference. So just in case anyone else was also in her position, I changed that description slightly in the second edition, which has just come out. But basically, I think point of view, in a memoir, you have to write from your own point of view at the time. And the best you can do is to um, embrace the possibility of other points of view, um, and try and reflect changing points of view as time goes on. Um, but I very much avoid any writing with any sense of criticism of other people's points of view. I think they're very valid. Um, I may not share them, but I have to write from who I was at the time and what I experienced with the utmost truth. And I've always believed in writing from the heart.
And that's where the integrity comes from. When I was writing about my late aunt, Aunt Ivy, who left Trinidad in 1922, the gaps in our archives,
Mm-hmm.
even in family memory, there's, not much, even in the oral tradition, not many people remember
Yes.
her or
Okay.
much about her. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but then it sort of took on a different slant because I decided to write from as if I could speak to her, so to use an epistolary sort
Yes.
of format where I could
Mm-hmm.
communicate with her, albeit I was pretending it was dialogue. Of course, it's one way in a sense, in a literal sense
Mm.
on the page. Did you experiment with any devices, or were you very faithful to sort of the chronology of your narrative?
I was faithful to the chronology of the narrative, and I didn't. There isn't a great deal of conversation in my memoirs, but what conversation there is exactly remembered from the facts from incidents. But I do see your point. For instance, one of the things I'm toying with is writing a fictional account of my grandmother's life, um, who came to Australia in 1869, and eloped with my grandfather. And it's I'm in sort of thinking about how I can tell this story, and in the from which is sort of set in a vastly different world, in a vastly different, in another, that's another century, and how I can sort of enter into her being. So it's an interesting point, but from the point of view of memoir, when you're writing as yourself, I think it's much less complicated.
Yeah, you sort of the integrity really is about staying true to your own point of view and your own voice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and
While
one of the things that
while being I was just going to say, staying true to your own integrity, but while being considerate of the fact that there will be other points of view, and not writing anything that is going to be offensive, because
Mhm.
that it could be possible. I think one has to be uh, well, I can only say considerate and wide open to other points of view.
Mm, yes, and I think these are some of the challenges that uh, memoir
Mm,
writing maybe keeps some people on mute because you sort of get stuck
mm,
at these
hmm
sort of question points, question marks. One of the things I
Exactly.
love
Yes.
about one of the things I love about the details in your writing is the attention to the ordinary, the everyday. You were living an
Hmm.
extraordinary
Yes.
life as a diplomat's wife, but
Hmm.
sometimes we might overlook the power of something quite ordinary to carry through a narrative and to express something quite poignant or profound. Can you
Hmm.
express, how that worked for you in the sense of
Well, yes,
how do we
really.
sort of select what is worthy? We feel, oh, my life wasn't this big special life, but
Mm.
there's sometimes, oftentimes, just in the ordinary, there's something so valid.
Well, yes, and I think it's very important to remember the things that we notice and the things that affected us as time went on, and the things that have contain a deeper meaning. For instance, when we were in Angola, um, we there was gunfire at night. There was thousands of Cuban troops around the city, and security was a big issue. Um, and I remember um, at night we used to, we would go to bed, and I remember my husband once remarking, "Well, normally the any bullets flying around will be very high, so they should pass over our heads." And then we thought, but we really shouldn't have to be thinking of this. But I spent my days behind thick bars on an upstairs balcony, which I made into my sort of, study and workroom, looking out on the streets. And one of the things that used to touch my heart was there would be often be a funeral procession going along the street, and all too often it would be a tiny white coffin of a child, and this really broke my heart. But it just pointed
Mhm.
up the amount of disease and death and hardship that was going on outside, and even though, from my point of view, life was difficult, it just made it so clear that it was what I was experiencing was absolutely nothing in comparison with what people trying to eke out a living in the streets of Angola were going through. And so, just something as one little detail, like a tiny white coffin, can bring forth an enormous amount of musing um, and importance.
Yes, without becoming over sort of hyper emotional or making a show of emotion, just
Mm,
allowing those details
exactly.
to
Yes,
do the
but
work. Yeah,
sometimes,
that tiny white
yes,
coffin does all the
yeah, the
work.
details.
Mm.
Mm,
Yeah,
you don't have to say much more, really. Mm,
that's emotionally grueling.
mm,
Yeah, it's just to think in itself. And
mm,
but as
mm.
an interesting thing too is that you, in that context, often have found a sense of humor in the context,
Oh,
not of
yes,
that sort of scene, but in your own personal life and putting it in perspective of the
exactly.
hardship
Mm,
around you. And
mm,
so you manage to have quite a sense of
mm.
humor about it. And that's
Well,
one of the things that
well,
makes the reading so entertaining.
well, I've been told that I have a fine sense of the ridiculous, and I think if you leave that behind, you really don't survive very well in difficult circumstances because human beings are endlessly ridiculous, um, and our own reactions to things can be quite ridiculous sometimes as well.
Yes. Can you give us a little context about how you used food and travel and places and culture to do that emotional work without sort of drowning out the narrative theme of your story? Were you doing that sort of intuitively because of how you experienced it, or were you crafting it to some degree? How did that process work for you?
Well, both, I think, because as a diplomat's wife, I was responsible for um, creating, um, you know, dinners and gatherings where people could meet each other and create friendly relationships, and that involved dealing with a lot of food. But I was always very interested in finding out about the food and the culture and the natural remedies of the places where we were living. That always seemed to me to be part of, you know, part of the richness of each country we lived in. Um, and well, as you know, the first two books included recipes from the different countries, and I just always found that absolutely fascinating. You know, the food that was used, the spices, the history of them in the Caribbean, in Suriname in particular, the fact that each of the seven cultures had their own foods, their own spices, their own remedies. And that all seemed to me to be something that needed to be included as part of the whole experience. I've never been never seen the point of going to another country and living in a small ghetto and eating and experiencing only one's own culture, as it just makes no sense. You want to taste and smell and experience everything that's going on around you and find out as much as possible about how other people live and why they live that way. So, from that point of view, the history and the sort of the color and the tragedies all come into it. And so in some ways, the history of his history of food is something that is very close to the heart of a culture. It's very
Yeah.
much day to day, but also reflects, centuries of influence.
Hmm. And how did it change for you writing in that sort of big picture of the world way, and then your third memoir being so intimate and personal? How was that writing different for you? Did you notice in yourself a shift in process?
Well,
And
it was much more written from the heart and much more passionate. Um, it became much more from my own memories. Sometimes I consulted. Um, I had still some letters from that I'd written to my parents, but of course, you don't tell parents everything, do you? But sometimes just one word or phrase can bring back a whole pictorial memory. Um, how is it different? I think I was for the third memoir, which was the in fact memoir from earlier times. I was much more personally involved, and it was something which was probably easier to write because I was just writing from the heart and wanting to express um, the love, loss, and the whole concept of um, I don't know. I was just telling a very personal story, and it was easier to write. I could just sit down and write from the heart without having to think about any sort of more worldwide contexts.
the cultural and political context varied so
Exactly.
much. Yeah, yeah. But your story, your personal story, is as grand as your your diplomat wives stories. I mean, it's as unique. But do you think that the sense of the ordinary, how does that factor into your writing and making things very specific, very particular? If I didn't have such a grand story, do you think it's worth a memoir? What's your sense of what is worthy of memoir? What makes it, as I say, in your case, you happen to have lived these remarkable events
Sure.
and personal stories, but what's your sense of memoir in that context?
Well, I think everybody has a story which is worthy of memoir. Um, where I come from in Australia, round about the 1970s, there was a, a memoir published by a man called um, Facey, and it was just called A Fortunate Life. And he had the most tiny life you could imagine. And yet it's the most absorbing memoir because from the way he saw himself, the way he saw his surroundings. And he didn't ever live from this tiny country town. And yet he saw himself as one of the most fortunate of human beings, doing very small things and surrounded by, you know, very ordinary but extraordinary people. So I think everybody's story is worthy of a memoir, because everybody has a unique human trajectory and makes unique discoveries.
And were there any sort of aha discoveries for you in each or any of your memoirs where, as when you were writing, that took you by surprise, or maybe started to sort of lead the way and change the trajectory of what you thought you were writing? Were there any moments like that for you?
Let me think for a minute. Um, that's a difficult one. Um,
Was you to have a memory about writing a memoir? It's kind of
mm,
meta,
yes,
meta memoir.
yes, that's a tricky one. I know. I
Mhm.
think because I have such a vivid memory, I I just sort of called up what happened and looked at it. But I can't remember anything that absolutely surprised me or derailed the course of the memoir. To be honest, no. Um, it would be lovely if I could. It would make a better interview, but I can't.
No, 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 don't. There's no need to. Yeah, if nothing comes. But
Hmm.
do you have a sense of you sound really confident in what you set out to write, and for some writers, myself included, there's a sense of uncertainty, doubt. Where did you grow your confidence in the story that you wanted to tell? How did that emerge? Or did you just, is it sort of something that is just inherent in your process?
Well, I will say that you never really know where any kind of book is going. And for all three of my memoirs, the first chapter or the first two chapters um, didn't survive the editing process, because I
Yes.
think when you begin to write, you honestly don't know where it's going to go, and it's only when you've come to the end of a book that you look back on the first chapter and think, no, that won't do, or it's there's too much stuff in here. I have to get rid of it, and you get the once you've got to the end, then you go back and you can sharpen your first couple of chapters so it homes in on the direction of the book. And I think editing is just vitally important. And I don't know how many times I go through books, but all of have gone through all of my books, maybe 14, 15, 20 times, sharpening the sentences, moving commas, changing things so that the movement of the narrative goes faster and is more direct. And I think that process is what makes the book readable in the end, because you're writing from the point of, in the then you're editing from the point of view of the reader, um, and how it reads, and that's really important. You can't expect anybody to be bored, and so you have to, in a way, put yourself in the place of the reader and listen to how it reads.
So write like it's your story at first. You got to get
Hmm.
it out,
Hmm.
and then
Exactly.
edit like the reader. One of my guests,
Exactly.
a prolific poet, Tim Atkins, that I had my last conversation with, he said in our pre-chat that he considers himself a bad writer but a great editor.
Hmm. Yeah, that's
Because
probably
he
not a bad
believes
thing
in
to do.
edit, edit, edit. What we leave
Yes.
out, he said, is
Yes.
what makes the work. And he's writing poetry, but it sounds as
Mm.
though it's similar. I
Mm,
think for most of us
absolutely.
as writers, yeah.
Yes, well, I would say that you have to edit prose as though it's poetry almost, where try and make every sentence and every word count, and mold every sentence in your editing. It's very important. And I love that a bad writer but a great reader. I think
Great, great editor, a great
yeah,
editor. Yeah.
great editor, yes. But
Mhm.
I mean, I have read the odd self-published book taken from a diary where nothing was left out, and there is absolutely nothing more boring. It is deadly, and that simply doesn't work. You're not writing a diary; you're writing a story, and you have to remember that, even if it's your own story.
Yes, that narrative arc.
Hmm.
But yet you said that for you, memory doesn't come in fragments, right? You had this,
Oh,
did you decide on a theme and then write, and then the theme changed? Did you, as you got to the end and you look back, did you then say, aha, this is the theme and the title? And then you edited for that? How did that sort of narrative arc and theme come through for you?
well, I found that as I got to the end of each chapter, sort of a some kind of conclusion always seemed to present itself, so that it ended with a um, ended with something that was meaningful,
Mm,
um, and something that was perhaps a little bit philosophical. For instance, in one of the chapters in Suriname, I was describing a rather hilarious community concert that took place in Suriname, and one of the songs was a local choir who did a version of Schubert's "The Trout," where the delightful free trout is ambushed by the fishermen and basically caught and betrayed. And I saw that as a symbol of what had happened to the people of Suriname by
mm,
when succession of colonial powers came in, that the people had been basically, caught, hooked, captured, and betrayed. And so sometimes something that you're talking about will become a symbol for a wider, with a wider meaning.
excellent. So, Pam, just to wrap up, thank you so much for chatting with me and
Hmm.
illuminating your memoir process. And just to wrap up, I think you're doing some author talks. Your books are available online by
Hmm.
Chiselbury
Yeah,
Press. How do you want us to find? Do you want us to find you? Or are you busy writing?
I would love
Where
you to
where
find.
should we look for you?
Oh, look on Amazon and sort of other. Amazon is with the books available internationally on Amazon. My first two books have been reprinted in paperback form, so they are also widely available now. But sort of Amazon and all the usual book, sort of book companies they're there. Um, it's a little more difficult in a couple of countries, but basically have a look online, and you'll under my name or the titles of the books. Um,
Are
um,
you on social? Should we follow you somewhere, or is that not?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
I have. I've had
Is that becoming a part of your process as well?
quite a campaign on Instagram and Facebook, but particularly Instagram. And there've been a lot of posts to do with the three books. So there's some quite
Mm.
interesting reflections, pictures, posts on
Yes,
Instagram.
I
If you
remember
look that
seeing,
up.
yes.
Mm,
So
right.
you'll give me your links, so I'll share your links as well with
Yes,
everyone.
please. That would be
Yes,
fabulous. Yes,
yes.
Pamela O'Cuneen writer on Instagram, and but it's been great fun, and I've really, it's been a wonderfully creative and satisfying process, and so who knows what comes next.
Excellent. Well, all the
Okay,
best with it.
thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Been
Yeah.
really interesting. Bye.
Bye.